Okay, so let's get into some of the things that still stick with us. Darren and I each have our own little segments here that we're going to set up and then talk about. The first one we want to talk about actually does connect to Ashley Flowers' interview a little bit. The question is, did Burke come back downstairs after going to bed the night of the Christmas party? Now, John Ramsey has maintained throughout these last 28, 30 years here that Burke and JonBenet, more on JonBenet's side of it in just a second, but specifically Burke went to sleep and he stayed in bed. Now, he did mention that he's always said this, he helped Burke set up a toy that he
Yeah, he
wanted to
said they were
set up.
building a toy, which is possible because it was
It was
Christmas.
Christmas, the day after
So,
Christmas.
like,
Exactly.
that's the fun thing about Christmas is getting to do that stuff with your parents. That's an entirely plausible story.
Absolutely. And he's maintained that, but then said that Burke eventually went to bed. But in 2016, Burke told Dr. Phil something different. Now, here's the clip. And by the way, you'll hear it in a second, but Burke basically says, "Oh, yeah, I did actually come back down after everyone went to sleep." Well, that changes things because there's a lot more going on in that house than was originally reported. So here are the clips from both Burke in 2016 on the Dr. Phil show, and then John Ramsey talking with Ashley Flowers in her most recent interview.
If he knew anything, it would not be something he would thought
Is important.
important.
That's what I'm saying. Like, I wonder if there's something in there, like, even, so I know in the Dr. Phil, one of the things that came out was the idea that you used a flashlight to put him to sleep and that he came back down to play with a toy. Like, when he's down and people are sleeping, has he ever talked, like, did he get the sense that someone else was in the home? Did he hear anything? I don't know how long was he up?
No, we've never asked him that. I don't know. I didn't know, frankly, that he got up again. I'm not sure he did. Again, that's fiction. There's so much fiction out there.
Because it's just thrown out there. It's just Dr. Phil who says, you got up to play with a toy, and Burke says, yeah, I did. It was something that I wanted to put together. And then it kind of just like fades
Well,
away.
again, when we got home, John had fallen asleep.
But I know you and Burke
I
came.
put her to bed. Burke and I sat down and tried to put together one of his little toys for a little while, just because he wanted to. And then he went off to bed.
But you're saying like that whatever Dr. Phil said and Burke said on the show, he didn't come back down?
I didn't know that he came back down if he did.
Does
He
stuff
may
like
have-
that make you want to be like, oh my gosh, maybe there's something he knows?
Burke would have said something if something was weird, but
Okay.
he may have misunderstood the question
Sure.
too. That
Do you think Burke regrets doing it?
well, probably, but
I think your dad had said he used the flashlight that night to put you to bed, and then you snuck downstairs to play.
Yeah, I had some toy that I wanted to put together. I remember being downstairs after everyone was kind of in bed and wanting to get this thing out.
Did you use the flashlight so you wouldn't be seen?
I don't remember. I just remember being downstairs.
So what do we make of this? Because what I've realized is that someone is either John Ramsey or Burke are either lying. One of them is either lying or one of them is misremembering the events of that evening. And I have to say, John's response being like, "Oh, he may have misunderstood the question. Don't worry about that."
Yeah, that I just found. I mean, granted, Burke was 9 when this went down, so Burke's
100%,
memory
right.
of that Christmas night.
Yeah.
I mean, he could have said it. Maybe he remembered it. Maybe he misremembered it. It could have been another night. Obviously, Christmas is like one of those days that you tend to remember, especially as a kid.
Sure.
And his obviously sister died that morning or whatever, but that
Yeah.
next morning. But for him to just say, "Oh, he like didn't understand the question," feels like, oh, well, okay.
Well, why are you saying
Well,
that,
then
sticking up
how
for
do you
him?
know
Yeah,
that? And how?
right.
And is it possible though that John? Is there a third option? Where is it not misremembering and not lying? That Burke went downstairs, but John didn't know that.
I suppose so. I mean, I think that's what Burke is sort of implying here. But the thing is,
I mean, John was like,
Ramsey,
he would have said something, and I'm like, would he have?
would he have? Well, and that's the
Would he
thing. And
have?
how have you not, and Ashley even says this to her credit. She's like, so that's what I'm saying. She was like, do you think that there are things that you haven't talked with Burke about that may lead to some understanding of who may have done this if you're claiming it's an intruder? Because here they are, Ashley Flowers and John Ramsey sitting here in 2024, and there are new details of the case emerging in this particular moment in time that's crucial to the story. And he goes, oh, we just never really talked to him about that. What? You've had to rehash this story for people for 28 years, and you didn't think to talk to Burke even as an adult about it?
Yeah, your own son about it. I mean, like, wouldn't you want to know if there's any info? Like, that's the thing, is like, them being elusive doesn't really prove that they did it. But then why be so elusive about all of this? Not talking to the
Right.
cops, being like, oh, he must have, even when John Ramsey was like, well, Burke tends to smile a lot. When you're asking what time is it, he
Well,
might smile,
yeah.
which, okay, fair. People do that. Maybe they have an uncomfortable, they don't like looking people in the eye. Maybe smiling is their way for coping from some social things. We don't know. I'm not trying to make fun of him or any sort of thing. Like, it's not bad, but to just kind of a little bit why? I mean, like, how could you blame the public for kind of thinking all these things together and then just coughing
Yeah.
it up to be this like natural occurrence? It's like, well, you're not really doing us any favor. Like, you're inviting us to think that way. Like, you are really like,
Well,
like, oh, I deleted the text. I don't save my text messages. It's like, here, you don't save your text messages because you've been doing something fucking nefarious. It's like
right.
that, an example of that. Like, it's just so easy to cop out of it.
And in that moment too, John Ramsey even goes, but again, that like there's so much fiction out there. And Ashley was like, no, Burke said this on Dr. Phil just a few years
Right.
ago. And like
He
reads
said
the
it. He
quote back.
admitted it on
Yeah.
Dr. Phil. Like,
Yeah.
I wish the Netflix, and maybe they couldn't, but I wish they did a better job of referencing back to that doc, because that was the last influential doc that was really about
Mm-hmm.
JonBenet.
Yeah.
So, uh, is it possible John Ramsey had absolutely no idea whether or not he went down to that night that JonBenet was killed?
Yeah.
Yes, it's possible. But once you hear him say that 20 years later, when you hear him say that on the CBS interview, don't you ask him about it?
Yeah. Yeah. You got to
Don't you
ask
now
that.
have an answer to 8 years later after the CBS thing? Don't you now be like, yeah, I spoke to him after he said that, and like it turns out, he went down to get a glass of water, or he
Right.
wet the bed and wanted to change it, like whatever the fuck it was. It was like,
And
you don't have any answer for that. Like, that's sus.
And aside from whatever he was doing, the question is, what did you, oh, you were down, oh, you went back downstairs? Did you notice anything? Did you feel, did
Right.
you hear?
Hey,
What else did you do?
sorry, there's a dog here, and the dog keeps growling at me.
Oh,
As soon as I said
uh-oh.
JonBenet, the dog like got like, not
Oh,
growling isn't like wants me to
dog,
pay attention to her.
dog.
Yeah, dog. Oh, we're getting to it. We're getting to it.
Guys, get into the Patreon or listen to NMR this week because yeah. So, there's this particular thing just changes the timeline for Burke
And
or
how do
for
you just,
John.
it's just not overly believable to me that he never talked to him about this. I just don't really believe that. I can't really imagine that it's like after all of these years,
Right.
you've never talked to your son about losing
About
his
this.
sister,
Now,
like
I
on
will
that
say this
night.
too.
Like,
I agree with you. I will say, just to be kind of the person that tries to like make sense of this, listen, I lost a family member who was 27 at the time. Not necessarily comparable. I'm just letting you know, like the family dynamic of talking about a death, no matter what it is, death by natural causes, an accident, a murder like this. Sometimes people don't know how to cope and they just don't. And I'm not saying this to you. I know you know this, Darren. I'm just mentioning it for the listeners. Sometimes people don't know how to cope or don't have the right kind of coping skills. And so talking about it
totally.
can be painful. And that might be why they don't want to talk about it. But
Absolutely. I mean, how could it not be painful, right? Like, how
of
could it not be
course.
painful?
Right,
But in
right,
all of these years,
right.
you never bring that up once. That seems unlikely to me. I'm not saying it's impossible. I mean, I will say, if you read some of the comments on this Ashley Flowers interview, I think it was a woman who commented, she's like, I never really believed John Ramsey, like freezing up, not knowing what to say, kind of like stiffening every time someone, but then
Yeah.
I can't remember the exact comment, but she was like, but then someone in my life died and I found them, and the shock and my reaction to it was not what I was expecting. And so like,
Right.
made me, and we always talk about that on that show. So it's like, I'm not going to judge anyone for having a different reaction or a shocked reaction, and or not wanting to talk about it. But it's been 30 years. You'd kind of think, especially when clearly you can talk about it because you're going on television talking about this for 2 hours, you're capable of talking about it.
And the motivation behind you doing all these appearances is so that we can find the killer. So isn't that what you want to do here? Help people get all the information that they need to help really find justice here.
Well, especially if you're innocent, you'd kind of think that, like,
right.
the trauma would be, obviously for everyone to think that you're guilty is trauma.
For sure.
Everyone thinks you're fucking guilty and you're not. I can't even imagine that hell.
Right.
I can't imagine that hell, and that's crazy. But if you are innocent, then the only people that know that you're innocent is your family, and you'd think that of all the people you're able to talk to, especially if you're innocent, would be them. And then it's the trauma of the public not believing you, and also the fact that your sister passed away or your daughter passed away. It's not, I'm guilty and I don't know how to talk about it. It's like a different type of...
It's true.
So that's just always going to be a
one.
mystery. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving on to number 2, which is always going to be the thing I think we never got the answer to, which is always going to be the thing I think that just doesn't make any fucking sense for anyone's justification, is Patsy had to have written that note, right? The ransom note I'm talking about. Okay. So the ransom note was found on the steps, which was weird. Why on the steps?
That led to their master bedroom, by the way. So,
like, they would have found the note. Their daughter's missing. She's 6. She's not 18 and was out at a party late at night because everyone's home from school. She's 6.
Yeah.
If she's not in the house, it's a problem. So they would have looked and found a ransom note. Why on the steps? And then there was speculation, of course, given the background, that Patsy had written it. It was written on their stationery. We have the $118,000 ransom money for it. But here's sort of this interesting thing. Listen to this clip we found from ABC News, dated September 27th, 1998. So this is just less than 2 years after this case went down. Play the clip, John.
Sources say the ransom note written by the alleged kidnapper is considered a key piece of evidence. Handwriting experts have ruled out John Ramsey and others close to the family. They have not excluded Patsy Ramsey, who has submitted several samples. The ransom note analysis, however, doesn't end with handwriting. The detectives enlisted the help of this man, Professor Donald Foster of Vassar College.
You look at something and you figure out who wrote it, in essence.
Yes, that's what I do best.
Foster analyzes not the handwriting, but the text, the content, and syntax.
Use of language, grammar, source material, borrowings, political or religious opinions, and anything that might enter into making a piece of writing distinctively one person's or another's, from punctuation to spelling and so on.
The professor once discovered Shakespeare was the author of a centuries-old manuscript, and the FBI hired him to prove Ted Kaczynski wrote the Unabomber Manifesto. But he is perhaps best known for proving Anonymous was really Newsweek's Joe Klein. Early in the case, Foster actually volunteered his expertise to Patsy Ramsey after reading of her extreme distress. Ironically, she never called, but the Boulder District Attorney's Office did. In the Ramsey case, Foster had high marks for the detectives who brought him an impressive sampling of Patsy Ramsey's writings, letters, notes, even files police retrieved from the family computer.
My experience with the Boulder detectives was that they were entirely professional in their work, that they were dedicated to the case.
Have you determined who wrote the ransom note?
I have no comment.
Foster is bound by a confidentiality agreement with the Boulder Police Department, but sources tell us in his report, summarized by detectives in the June presentation of evidence, Foster identified the writer of the ransom note as Patsy Ramsey. Foster analyzed commonly used words and also found similarities between Patsy's letter format and that of the ransom note writers. The indentations and punctuation, especially the repeated use of the exclamation point. We looked back through our own archives and found 2 samples of Patsy's writing, this 1996 Christmas letter peppered with exclamation points, and this 1978 photo with a 2-line note, each sentence ending in an exclamation point. Also, sources say as many as 250 books were cataloged and photographed from various rooms in the Ramsey house. In the event, they yielded possible clues. At least one book found in the bedroom did. Mindhunter by FBI profiler John Douglas. In Chapter 16, there is a case of a young girl who was kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and suffocated with duct tape. When the killer called the mother, he began with the words, "Listen carefully." The same two words begin the ransom note. Patsy Ramsey has said she found the note at the bottom of the back spiral staircase. She has said she read it and then called for John. In an interview for A&E airing tomorrow night, John Ramsey recalled his reaction after he read the note.
That was the worst moment, was suddenly realizing that someone had your daughter, your child, and has taken her, and she was gone, and we didn't know where she was, and it was dark, it was cold outside.
But there's something curious here. According to a source, there are no fingerprints on the ransom note. Not Patsy Ramsey's nor John Ramsey's. The question is, if the Ramseys held the note to read it, where are their prints?
Okay, so that, unlike the Netflix documentary,
Yeah.
which seemed to conclude, if I'm remembering this correctly, that
Yeah.
they couldn't prove that Patsy or John
Yeah,
or
I
Burke
think
or
that's
anybody
correct.
had written it, which, okay,
Right.
fine. But this clip says otherwise. And
You
there's
know-
a lot of conflicting reports about that. And so it's like, is it like dental imprints? Is it like, is this something that we can really go on in the court of law? Like, why write a ransom note as like, why do it? And let me just also say before you hop in, Ashley
no, go ahead.
Flowers also asked John Ramsey about it. And she's like, why the $118,000? Like, why the $118,000? That's just so specific. And he's like, I think. And she also was like, why the fuck write it when JonBenet is dead? And he's like, I think it was to send us a message. I think people hate rich people, which I do agree with. I think people do hate rich people. And this was to send a message and to show people that, kind of like no one was safe, no matter how much money you make.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, okay. But she's already dead. So what
Right,
message are you
that's-
sending?
what's
She's
the
dead
message
already.
there? Right,
The
exactly.
message is that she's dead, not that you're writing a random ransom note. And yet it takes like 20 minutes to write out that letter handwritten. The killer is just going to stay there and handwrite things with like perfect penmanship. Like, it doesn't make any
Yeah.
sense.
And the professor that is featured in the clip that we just aired has quite a stacked resume of being able to figure out handwriting samples from people, including Shakespeare of all people. So if true, and I'm not saying it's not true, I'm just saying it was 1998, because anything went in the 90s apparently when it came to this stuff. Like he's saying Patsy wrote this. And the two things that really stuck out to me about that clip that help really reaffirm to me that Patsy Ramsey had to have written this. The one being the exclamation points and all the the sources that they use, like she had written, I want to say, was it like a yearbook or something?
She like
with
inscribed, a book or a year.
points?
Exactly. I was going to say like a novel, something. And like people
Yeah.
do use exclamation points, but like not as much handwritten as they do in emails.
Right.
That they wouldn't.
Right.
Obviously, email wasn't really a thing.
Right.
And it looked just like it.
Looked
I mean,
kinda
I'm not-
like
I'm
it.
not a handwriting expert, but like it looked pretty similar.
And then of all things, they cataloged the books that were in their house, and there was the John, as was just mentioned in the clip, the listen carefully part. I mean, how do you overlook that? Could it a coincidence?
Could it be? It could be a coincidence.
Sure.
I mean, it's not specific enough for me to be like, that's the linchpin, but it is a little on the
No,
nose.
for sure.
It's on the nose.
Very on the nose. Very on the nose.
And that just like
And you know what? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
just doesn't know it. It's just why write it? Why write it?
John Ramsey, at some point, again, by the way, when I say I've listened and watched to a million interviews, I can't even, that's minimal. Over the weekend, when I was spending all this time on YouTube looking for interviews from John Ramsey, he had actually specifically mentioned that John Douglas himself had actually made a profile. This is, by the way, back in the 90s, early 2000s, of the killer and said that the killer had to have been someone that the family knows and this and that. So he was also citing John Douglas. So that tells you that both he and Patsy were a big John Douglas fan back in the day. They had the book and probably read it. And I don't know. I just find like the system here is like, okay, but the listen carefully is probably in your head to some degree, somewhat recently.
Yeah, I
And
mean, easily. And just
yeah,
like, why
we'll
write
never
it?
know. And isn't
Why
it crazy
write
too?
it? It doesn't make
And
any sense.
and isn't it crazy too? I think you mentioned this, Darren, that wasn't it there no fingerprints on
Yeah,
the
and
note?
a good call. Another thing was that there was absolutely no fingerprints on the note. And you'd think that if Patsy Ramsey found this note, is she reading it standing up? You'd pick it up.
Oh, I hadn't even put that together yet.
You'd pick it up. Why wouldn't it have had her DNA on it? And if it didn't have her DNA on it,
You're on to
then
something
then
here.
that's weird. If
I
there's no
hadn't even put that
fingerprints at
together.
all, if you're holding up a letter, you're not going to read it standing over it. I mean,
Right.
if and granted this was Patsy and this was John, but like
Yeah.
if you're smart enough to find a note and know that this is a crime scene immediately and not read it, then you should be married to a person who should know. And I don't blame him for this because
Yeah.
it was his daughter for not taking the fucking duct tape off of JonBenet and
Well,
picking
that
her
was
up.
insane.
Knowing it was a crime scene and then seeing her, if your wife knows not to pick up a ransom note, then you should know
Right.
not to pick up your daughter.
Period.
I don't blame him for picking up his daughter. I would have done the same fucking thing. But I
I
also
think
would
I
have
would have too, to be
100%
honest. Yeah.
picked up the fucking ransom note and my fingerprints would have been on it.
100%.
That is
So,
way too careful. That's all I'm saying.
yeah. Listen carefully, if you will. So that's the
Yes.
one, the ransom note we'll never know probably, but it's looking like it might have been Patsy. All right, Darren, let's move on to number 3 here.
Yeah, number 3. Okay, here's the 10 a.m. call that came and went, and
Yeah.
police noted that no one seemed to care. So here's some background info on this. The ransom note
Yeah.
mentions, obviously, they're asking for they're from a foreign
That's
faction.
right.
They're asking for $118,000. They're going to get a call the next day at a certain time for sort of this drop-off point. Very theatrical, very movie-like things that
Right.
we see. So conflicting info in Linda Arndt's report, which is what you had read, she
Yeah.
said that no one made mention that the call had not been made.
Yeah. Yeah. Never
Okay, so
happened.
here's the quote. Prior to 1000 hours, that's right, yeah, 1000
Yeah,
hours,
1000
I
hours,
remained
yep.
in or near the den area of the house. So that's literally 10 a.m. Patsy remained in the front sitting room area. The friends of the Ramseys and the pastor divided their time between Patsy and John. John Ramsey paced between the area of the den and the formal dining room. John was usually by himself. I did not see John or Patsy interact with each other. No one in the house made any obvious comment to me that it was after 10 a.m., after 1000 hours, and the suspected kidnappers had not called. Wouldn't you be waiting by the phone? I mean, interacting with your
very least,
husband
yeah.
and wife, talking about it, you'd kind of think that this would be like the moment to know, because then maybe the suspected killer would call and you'd have some sort of lead,
Direction,
potentially,
right.
something.
Yeah, and the other thing too about this that I never really thought of until just now as you read that back to me was that clearly this person also had their phone number. So how did they get that? Like
Right.
someone knows their phone number. Now listen, could someone look it up in a phone book back in 1996? Maybe, but it's not as easy to get a phone number back then as it is today. So that's another interesting little tidbit. But my thoughts too were, shouldn't they have been like for hours strategizing on what to do exactly? Linda Arndt in that police report does say she told John a couple specific things about what to say. First, oh, we can't get the money until 1700 hours. Tell us what, like she gave him little notes on what to, that he wanted to speak directly to JonBenet. That was another thing that the police were coaching him on if someone were to call. Besides that, no one's like, should we all be here? Should we stay in this home? Like
Should
no
be
one's
recorded,
thinking like that. Yeah.
And in Ashley Flowers' interview, John Ramsey does mention that he called his friend, who's also his banker, which was a weird thing to
That's
say.
right.
Why say friend? Like, okay, banker, who decided to up his ATM limit.
That's right.
It was
Yes.
like withdrawal to see if he could take the money out. He remembers giving his debit card or whatever to a friend in order to take the money out, and they came back and no money was taken out. because it turned out they didn't need it. They didn't need to get the money.
That's
It was
right.
kind of unclear how he ended that or why they didn't need to get the money, perhaps because JonBenet was found. And so
Right.
if your daughter was found dead, but again, why do all of that and
Right.
leave JonBenet in the house? Get the money. Get the
Yeah.
money. If you've already killed her, hide her and get the money. It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, it all points to the suspicion about this phone call, which is that nobody was expecting it to begin with.
Right.
And that's the thing that kind of makes everyone look bad. I mean, you know, I don't know exactly. I don't want to speak on behalf of the Fleets. I'm sorry, the Whites who were there, Fleet and Priscilla White, John's at the time best friend and his wife. There was another couple there that I'm forgetting and or were redacted from the police report. And then their church priest was also there. As far as we can tell from what you just read, Darren, no, like Linda Arndt reports, no one in the house, quote, no one in the house made any obvious comment to me that it was after 1000 hours and the suspected kidnappers had not called. Everyone in that house should have been laser focused on the hours of 8 to 10 a.m. and no one cared.
Right.
That is very extremely suspicious. And by the way, this has been talked about a lot. So this isn't like brand new news here, but I'm just saying when you put it in the context of the police report and the Netflix documentary and what Darren was just saying about the $118,000 that suddenly wasn't needed, well, it's all starting to look even more sus than it already
Combined with
did.
no fingerprints on the ransom note. It just like,
Yeah.
okay. All right. Let's get
So
to the
let's
next
move on to
topic.
the next one. This one is kind of minor, but it is something that caught my eye when I was reading the police report as well. The question here is, did John Ramsey read JonBenet a story before he put her to bed the night of the 25th? So the background info here is that John has always claimed that she fell asleep, and Patsy had always claimed that JonBenet had fallen asleep in the car on the car ride home. He carried her straight up to bed, and that Patsy came in later and changed her. In some interview, changed her into nighttime clothes. In some interview I've seen, and I'm sure you can find this quickly, it's not buried somewhere, I just don't have the exact source. John had said that that was typically their routine with the kids, that he would bring one or both of them into their beds, Patsy would go in and change them, and on they would go to sleep.
Right.
But the story changed a little bit because in the original police report, he says that he read her a story, which would indicate that she was awake to some degree before she had fallen asleep. Like I said, it's a small detail. It's probably so small that it could go either way, but I feel like either she was asleep and went to bed right away, or she was asleep, stayed up, and you spent a couple more moments with her reading her a story. Those are two kind of different timelines.
Yeah,
going
I mean,
on.
for him to remember that he's making a toy with Burke, you'd think that he'd kind of remember at least
Good
reading
point.
JonBenet a story. So, you know, it doesn't imply anything other than you'd kind of think that that
That would
detail,
be
if said once,
included.
would have been remembered in perpetuity.
And to your point, if it's being omitted later on, was it a lie? You have to ask that
Right.
question. So here's exactly what is in the police report. Quote, Officer French, who was another responding officer there when Linda Arndt arrived, Officer French told me that when he arrived, he met with Patsy Ramsey, JonBenet's mother. Patsy was very upset and distraught, and it was difficult for Officer French to obtain information from her. Officer French also spoke with John Ramsey, JonBenet's father. Officer French learned that the Ramsey family had been at a friend's house on the late afternoon and evening of December 25th, 1996. They returned home at approximately 2200 hours on December 25th. JonBenet and her brother Burke went to bed shortly after the family returned home. John Ramsey had read to JonBenet after she'd gone to bed and before she went to sleep, end quote. So a
it's in
very
there.
specific thing that he
He
read
said
to
it.
her after she had gone to bed, but before she fell asleep. But you don't hear about this bedtime story at all throughout any part of the,
Yeah,
you
you
know,
kind
his
of think he
stories.
would have mentioned it because it's kind of this
Yeah.
innocuous detail that, like, why wouldn't you include it? You know, so for you
Yeah.
not to include it makes it a little bit more sus.
And I love what you said about Burke. Like, yeah, he remembers the Burke moment, but you don't really remember telling her a story, or that's changed or fluctuated over the years. I just find it weird. All right, let's move on to the next one, which
So-
really grinds my gears. Oh boy.
Yeah, 3 different people checked the perimeter and no one noticed the broken window.
That
Like, I
was in
don't
the basement,
understand.
yeah.
Like, that was in the basement. Background info, the downstairs basement had a broken window with a suitcase underneath it. Presumably, if 2 people were working together on this, the suitcase might have been a good step down for that person or something.
Or step up for whenever they were
Or a
leaving.
step up
Right.
to get out. Now here's conflicting info from the police report. This is taken, it's cut off a little bit, but John told me that he personally checked all of the doors and
That's
all
right.
of the windows in the home this morning. All the doors and the windows were locked.
Yeah, so John tells Linda Arndt personally, just checked all the windows, just checked all the doors. By the way, there's a report that there's over 100 windows in this house.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit unbelievable to
It's a
begin
big
with.
house. It's a 6,500 square foot
Huge.
house.
Yeah, it's huge. It's way bigger than it looks when you see the front kind of A-frame that you see all over the tabloids. So John says, I looked, all good here. Okay.
Yeah. Then Sergeant Reichenbach said there was a light dusting of snow on the ground when he arrived at the Ramsey residence. Sergeant Reichenbach did not notice any footprints or other tracks in the snow, and the sergeant personally checked the exterior of the Ramsey residence. He did not notice any signs of forced entry to the residence.
Very interesting. And then Darren, do you want me to take this last one?
No, I can.
You're good? Okay.
Yeah. Officer French told me that there was no apparent forced entry to the Ramsey home. Officer French had checked the Ramsey home and had not detected any sign of JonBenet. 4 friends of the Ramseys had been notified by the Ramsey of JonBenet's disappearance and were currently at the house. The pastor from the Ramsey's church had also been notified and was also present at the house. Why are all these fucking people at the fucking house? It should just be the fucking police.
Right.
But the Boulder Police Department victim advocates had been notified, and they were also present inside the Ramsey home.
Yeah. So 3 different people, the owner of the home and 2 police officers, checked the perimeter and did not see, I guess you could say, did not see the broken window. Now, this obviously just leads you to try to figure out obviously, was there a broken window at the time, at least that the 2 officers looked? Probably, right? Because there's not a lot of time for John to kind of sneak downstairs and break a window and set up a crime scene, but okay. But the fact that 2 police officers and the owner of the home did not see the broken window.
How are you not checking every room? How are you not
bothers
checking
me.
every room?
Well, and another thing from the police report, you guys got to go watch, read, or listen to this police report because you're going to find a lot of stuff. One of the other officers, I'm forgetting which one it was either Reichenbach or French, says they did go down into the basement. They even went all the way back to where the cellar is, but there was a latch or some sort of door that was latched or locked, and they did not go into the cellar. It was like, you could maybe say it was the only room in the house that they did not go into.
And it happened to be the one that John.
And it happened to be the one that she was lying dead in, allegedly, because maybe not. Maybe at that point
Maybe
she was
not.
in a different location. No one really knows.
Maybe
But
not. I don't know. And
Anyway.
it's just all very conflicting. All right, go to the next.
yeah, let's
one.
keep it going
Another
here.
thing.
So number 6 here, and then we only have one more after this, which is, I just generally find this one interesting, which is just simply, what does Fleet White know? Fleet White is John's former best friend. That they were the ones hosting the party on Christmas night that the Ramseys were at before they came home. There's so much detail about Fleet White and his falling out with John Ramsey. We don't even know where to begin with it. So we just wanted to include it here because maybe you guys will want to go look at the information yourself. It has been reported, though, that Fleet White confronted John Ramsey, urging him to cooperate fully with the police investigation and expressing concerns about the Ramseys' decision to hire private investigators and criminal attorneys. This confrontation apparently even reportedly escalated and resulted in this big heated argument that required some sort of police intervention. And in the Ashley Flowers interview, he even mentions Fleet White again and says, oh, that must have been a big red flag about something. I can't even remember what it was. So he's still, even all these years later, kind of like not throwing him under the bus, but putting little jabs towards Fleet White. And just knowing that Fleet White was one of the last people that saw JonBenet alive, if the timeline that we have all been told is correct, and given that he was really trying to get John Ramsey to cooperate with the police, because as we know, they were very reluctant to speak to police for months.
And that feels like a good just friend thing to say. Like, hey, it's probably best to just cooperate here.
Right, but and so what would be the conflict with John Ramsey there? Like, why would John Ramsey be like, "Oh
Right.
no,
Why would
don't
he
worry
be
about
so
that"?
like crazy about that? Like that doesn't, it's just a weird tidbit. Again, it's not indicative of anything other than like, why? Why would that be a
Yeah.
bad thing?
And just to throw it out there really quickly before we wrap up our last little thought here that sticks with us about the JonBenet Ramsey case, Darren, I had sent you a link, and maybe we'll put it in the show notes and stuff as well. But there was also a moment a couple years later connected to someone trying to bribe somebody to get a copy of the ransom note. And what happened was, this was during like the media circus that happened in the fallout of JonBenet Ramsey's murder. And Fleet White was somehow associated with this person and was subpoenaed by the court to testify and talk about this guy who was trying to get the ransom note. And Fleet White has gone on record to say that he intentionally avoided the subpoena and did not show up to court in the best interest of the JonBenet Ramsey case. There's not really a lot more to that. He was subpoenaed later for not following the subpoena, if that makes sense. You guys are gonna have to go into like Reddit or something and look that.
But
that
why
one
would
up.
not
But
talking
why would
help
he not
someone?
want to talk?
Why?
Yeah.
Why would that might help the JonBenet Ramsey case, but not necessarily solving JonBenet's killer. So why would
Exactly.
you not want to participate?
So that's why I was like, at the top of this, I was like, what does Fleet White know? We may never know.
And kind of along with that, I mean, I think it's just important to note that in 1999, a grand jury voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey, but charges were never brought to the Boulder DA. But this info was revealed in 2013 when some court documents went unsealed. And the grand jury voted, they charged them with crimes related to their 6-year-old daughter's death. That basically was like, you kind of messed with the crime scene. So it was 1 count of child abuse resulting in death and 1 count of accessory to a crime, just kind of messing with the crime scene in general. And the grand jury issued 2 separate but identical indictments for each parent. And this is what they state. On or between December 25th and December 26th, 1996 in Boulder County, Colorado, JonBenet Ramsey did unlawfully, knowingly, recklessly, and feloniously permit a child to be unreasonably placed in a situation which posed a threat of injury to the child's life or health, which resulted in the death of JonBenet Ramsey, a child under the age of 16. And on or between December 25th and December 26th, 1996 in Boulder County, Colorado, JonBenet Ramsey did unlawfully, knowingly, and feloniously render assistance to a person with intent to hinder, delay, and prevent the discovery, detention, apprehension, prosecution, conviction, and punishment of such person for the commission of a crime, knowing the person being assisted has committed and was suspected of the crime of murder in the first degree and child abuse resulting in death.
I mean, it's a lot of legalese here, but essentially what this is saying is that a grand jury has said John and Patsy helped a third party.
We're at least negligent. We're at least negligent.
Well, an accessory to the crime means that they were aware of what's going on. So like that, and by the way, so here's what happened with that, Darren. I think you were mentioning this. The grand jury voted to indict, but the DA, whose decision it is then to press the charges and take it to trial, I'm forgetting his name, Alex something, Hunter, I believe is his last name, decided not to do that at the time, and that was, in fact, here I have a part of that, a story from CBS News. The district attorney at the time, Alex Hunter, who presented the evidence to the grand jury, declined to pursue charges, saying, quote, I and my prosecutorial team believe we do not have sufficient evidence to warrant the filing of charges against anyone who has been investigated at this time. And I don't know. I mean, not that every single grand jury is going to be perfect, but they...
Right, or they're going to be correct, but it's just like that. I think that's an important point, that at least to them, to this jury of their peers, there was enough kind of evidence to at least show that this is sussy.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
This is sussy,
And it's weird to think that had they gone to trial, would John Ramsey be a free man right now? Especially in the late 90s when everyone was kind of looking at the family to begin with? Probably not, to be completely honest. Well, these are the things that stick out to us. There's probably
leave comments for us. Let us know if you have
Exactly.
sussed these out accordingly, because we genuinely want to know.